So excited about the opportunity to be with you guys today. And Dee Dee, you know, you were always an inspiration here at Children's. And then when you left and moved out into the community and started doing the work that you do through Hearts Connected, I was just not surprised at all and was really excited to see this very, very important work move forward outside of the hospital as well. So I love it. I'm glad that that you're out there making this happen, and all of your child life specialists, friends, and the people who you're working with are really fortunate to have you as a leader. So great job, y'all. I came to this work after probably 15 years of being a wilderness guide. So I've always had the mindset that adventure and challenge and adversity were our friend as a teacher, right? And there's no greater place and no greater learning context, I believe, than healthcare for learning and growing about in our own self-knowledge, and both that and as professionals. So these pictures are just kind of a little background. We went skiing this winter in California with some friends. I used to live in Lake Tahoe, and I took my 12-year-old, the little guy with the blue shirt there, on a trip out to California skiing. And that was from a trip to Cumberland Island last winter, which was really hot and very, very challenging. There's my 14-year-old daughter. She's awesome in theater. And then that's a picture of Jackie and I at the beach on Tybee Island here in Georgia. A couple summers ago, we were isolating as a family, and we actually had a car accident while we were down there, which launched a 2-year really challenging period of time for us. So the skills I'm going to talk about today, let's see if I can get this to move.
Yeah, absolutely.
The skills I'm going to talk about today are very much about being able to, in the moment, in the face of difficult circumstances, when the child is flipping out and or the parent is having a really hard time coping with the circumstances at hand. The skills I'm going to share with you guys today are like the proto skills for coping with stressful circumstances and difficult adverse events in the hospital. I'm really kind of focusing in on just our introduction. So the Community Resiliency Model was started by a social worker, a medical social worker in California, and another woman that she worked with. They created this model that is a strength-based and resiliency-informed model for self-care and the care of others. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But at its core, Community Resiliency Model is really meant to be sort of a frontline tool for healthcare workers, both caring for themselves and caring for other people. So as an introduction, you're only going to get a piece, and I'm going to really be moving fast because I have, whatever, 6 hours worth of content on this. The training was multiple days. I want to make sure that you guys know where you can go for more information. So there's 2 places. If you look on your app, your app store on your phone, look up iChill, and you'll find this iChill app, which is basically the introduction and all the other content that follows for the Community Resiliency Model. You could also go to the Trauma Resource Institute, which is where I'm certified as a CRIM trainer, and there's tons of great information there, and you can learn more if this really kind of piques your interest and seems like something you want to learn more about. So the Community Resiliency Model is meant to be a resource, right, for everyone. The community aspect of this is focused on the world around us, and then the individual piece is for ourselves and those people who are closest to us. The beauty of this model is it's been used across the world, really, at this point. It's being used on the ground in Ukraine and Poland right now. It's been used in various locations across the country when mass casualty events occurred. The Dalai Lama is having the Trauma Resource Institute establish the Community Resiliency Model as a training for all of the children in the school system, Tibetan school systems in northern India. There are so many applications of this happening right now. So the beauty of it is that it's affordable, right? These resources rest with you, and you can carry them with you wherever you go. They're adaptable regardless of the context, whether it be cultural circumstances, ethnic differences, parts of circumstances happening in the hospital with different types of families and different events. It's very adaptable. And from that standpoint, it is completely accessible to people as well. Even if they don't have fluency and can't read, you can still teach people the skills, the wellness skills we're going to talk about today. Even if they come from a culture that's very different from yours, the resources, the wellness skills we'll talk about today are adaptable and commonsensical for people from all sorts of different backgrounds. So our goal with the program as a whole is to really work toward developing common language regarding self-care and resiliency. Those terms are used so prolifically, and they've kind of almost become empty, right? So I'm going to try and do that a little bit today about what self-care and resilience actually is from the standpoint of the Community Resiliency Model. I'm going to start calling it CRIM. That's what we call it, is CRIM. That'll shorten my presentation by at least 10 minutes if I just say CRIM instead of Community Resiliency Model. We're going to talk about developing a strength-based and resiliency-informed self-care strategy. We'll learn to identify when our nervous system is triggered by high stress. So that's a really key aspect, is the science foundation of stress in response to adversity. We're going to talk about that. And then, the wellness skills really are focused on how to reset the nervous system, so that what you'll hear me say is so that you can enter back into your resilient zone when stressful things happen. The community piece is the outflow of this model in relationships that you guys have around you. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that today, but it is a key piece of the work that we do overall. So, many of you are familiar, and as child life specialists, I think this is at the center of the work that you do, trauma-informed care, right? I asked a group of staff at the hospital 2 weeks ago in a training I was doing if they'd heard of trauma-informed care, and still, to my dismay and confusion, it's not a super commonly understood term. So I'm going to talk about this just briefly, right? So our goal is to shift our perspective towards more of a strength-based resiliency. So historically, when people approach these, difficult circumstances, we look at people struggling with various, situations, and it can be the case that in response to how they're responding, we think in a conventional fashion. People are bad, like they make bad choices. There needs to be consequences. They just don't really care. We don't need to make excuses for people. Something's wrong with you. Why can't you just get it together, right? That's sort of the conventional, it can be a conventional view of people who are struggling with adversity. A trauma-informed perspective, right, is much more enlightened than that, right? We recognize that people are suffering and that they need help, right? They need effective interventions. They need support. They need care. They need information. People care, but maybe they just don't understand how to care for themselves or how to operate in a healthy way or a mature way when difficult things happen, right? So basically what people need is to learn how trauma impacts them, and we need to recognize how trauma impacts children and adult development. So across the spectrum of, psychosocial development from childhood to adulthood, how does trauma impact them? And, the question that we then ask is, what happened to you? That would be your assessment question when you look at things through a trauma-informed perspective. So That's good, right? There's nothing wrong with that. With resiliency and this idea of strength-based resiliency, we want to take it to a bit of a different level. So resiliency informed starts with the assumption that people are resilient, right? Everyone. People have some measure of resilient. I'm resilient, you're resilient. When difficult circumstances unfold, you need compassion, right? You need people who are willing to understand where you're coming from and maybe reach out and do things that are helpful for you. Humans in general need compassion. This resiliency informed model is rooted in the idea that science kind of answers the question of how to start coping with stress and anxiety related to adversity, right? And the skills that we'll talk about today start with self-regulation skills. So anyone can learn these skills. Kids, from the youngest age to the oldest humans can learn today these self-regulation skills because they're rooted in science and physiology, and they don't require a master's degree or an investment of time and money or therapy and counseling and all of that kind of stuff. You can start practicing these skills today. So the emphasis of this strength-based resiliency informed model is that people have what it takes to be resilient. So the question that we seek to answer is, what is right for you? What are your strengths? And how can you leverage those as, and as your primary mechanism for coping with the difficult circumstances that you face? So Elaine Miller Karras, this is a great book, Community Resiliency Model. It kind of walks through the model. If you're like, this is amazing, I want to do this, check it out. That's a good spot. So Elaine would say resiliency is a person or a community's ability to identify and use strength-based resources that enable choices. These choices can lead to a more full and thriving life and the ability to cope with the challenges of daily living. I think that's a really key piece, the challenges of daily living. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And that, resiliency is rooted not in just the most significant, challenging situations that we face on a regular basis, but it's really rooted in how we cope with the everyday stressors as a sort of foundation, how we cope with the everyday stressors that are a part of our lives personally. And I mean, that's a key piece, right? The most resilient people, have structures in their life that enable them to come to work in an environment like pediatric healthcare and cope with really significant, difficult challenges. So when our personal lives become really fraught with distressing circumstances, with adversity, with trauma, it can make the work that we do, 100 times harder. So that's just kind of an aside. But so starting with this, I want you guys just to take a brief second. Okay, we're really talking a brief couple of minutes here because we don't have a ton of time. So I'm setting my timer now. I want you to take 2 minutes, and I want you to reflect on an event in your personal or professional life that was really challenging. Something that really pushed you. It doesn't have to be a big thing. Like I said, it could be just sort of an average sort of challenge, but it pushed you. So we're going to wait a couple more seconds and let people kind of reflect on that personal or professional challenge, something that taxed your coping. And now I want you can write it down on a piece of paper, and we also encourage you to put it in the chat box. Name some of the things that you learned about what resiliency is and what it means to you based on that experience. So ways that how you cope, what you learned about resilience. I'll give you some examples. Resilience is a process. Resilience is a lifelong journey. Resilience is, something that is essential. Self-care is an important part of resilience. Taking time off is a key aspect of resilience. These would be examples of some things that you learned about resilience from a difficult circumstance that you experienced. So go ahead and throw some of those in the chat for people to see. And then I have a reflective question for you. Does that influence the way that you cope today? So whatever structures or the paradigm that you create in your life around resilience, does this difficult situation and the learning that you gain from that influence the way that you cope today? And then secondarily, does it influence the way that you understand resiliency? So I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes. I want you, with this last minute of, we're at 2 minutes now, but as I move forward, just reflecting on your own description of what resiliency is to you, a 1, 2, 3 sentence sort of description. And I'm going to come back and give you guys, some of y'all, an opportunity to share. It'll only be a few people, but nonetheless, it'll be interesting and fun to hear from y'all as well. All right, so I think you can get the sense that the starting point for this resiliency and strength-based, or I'm sorry, strength and resiliency-based self-care, right? Is that right? What I meant? How do I say it? Strength-based, yeah, resiliency-informed self-care. It starts very much with each of us as individuals. So our starting point with the Community Resiliency Model with CRIM is that we want to build on the strengths and foundation of strengths in your life and build on our understanding of resilience as an inherent and innate part of who we are as people. So with that in mind, we're going to launch into some of the key concepts that build on that foundation. So strength-based and resiliency-informed. So the first key concept I'm going to talk about today is what we call the resilient zone, a state of being, right? It's physiological is what I'm talking about, not a mental or emotional state, but a physical state of being where the mind and body are aligned, right? Allowing us to function at our best. And I would say where the mind and body are aligned in a way that's calm and, you know, if you're experiencing it, it's sort of neutral. There might not be any emotional charge to it or anything like that, but it's just a state of symbiosis between the mind and the body that allows us to function at our best, to be the best version of ourselves. Second foundational key concept is trauma is personal, right? So something that traumatizes me may not traumatize another person. So what qualifies as trauma is very unique and personal to each person. But the reality or the outcomes of being traumatized are consistent, and across humanity, we share the impact that trauma has on us. So we're not alone in the way that we respond to trauma, despite the fact that one person's trauma is very different from another person's. The third key concept is this idea of the elegant design, right? So I mentioned it before. Everything that we need for resilience is already present within us. We have what it takes. And when I say that, I'm not talking about resolving past traumatic experiences and the emotional impact that those experiences have had on us. What I'm really talking about is our physiology, the makeup of our physiology, right? It inclines us, if we're so inclined, toward resilience with a few key steps, which I call wellness. In CRIM, we call the wellness skills. But everything we need is there for us to move forward in being resilient and to make that starting point. And then the final thing is this belief in, what I call a growth mindset, that there is, and this is very evidence-based, and the military's done a lot of work on this, that there are positive psychological outcomes. So spiritual and emotional growth, right, is not just possible, but it's likely after difficult circumstances. So you guys know this, it's very intuitive. We're going to talk a little bit about this as a foundational part of the Community Resiliency Model. All right, so key concept 1, the resilient zone. So what is it? So the resilient zone is, in essence, it's a state of well-being in mind, body, and spirit that allows you to be the best version of you, right? So when you're in your resilient zone, right, you're able to handle the stressors of life. And you can be annoyed or angry. It doesn't, I'm not saying you're all zenned out, right? Like that kid in the picture. I'm saying you can handle the challenges that come at you, right? In the process of just being human, of daily living. So you can be annoyed, you can be angry, but you don't feel like you're going to lose your head. On the other side, so that would be what I'll call the elevated zone, right? Anger, annoyance, frustration. In the depressed zone, you can be sad, right? You can have, feelings of frustration, confusion, sadness, but you don't feel like you're going to be washed away by a river of sorrows. So the resilient zone is the reality of life and the experiences that we have on a daily basis, right? On a spectrum, feeling those feels, but operating still in a way that allows us to be the best version of ourselves, right? Things happen. We have thoughts and feelings and we react to circumstances. And it's totally normal to move around within the resilient zone or the okay zone, with feelings like being excited, worried, relaxed, angry, scared, calm, tired, sad, happy. All of those normal responses to life stressors can fall within the resilient zone. For some of us, we have narrow resilient zones. And I often think that, some of that comes from maybe, not having experienced some challenging circumstances in life. You kind of, had whatever, a normal, not so threatening, not so dramatic life experience. And then, suddenly challenge comes your way. And what happens often with adversity is we have to adapt and our resilient zone widens. So some of us have really shallow resilient zones, no judgment. It's not like a negative thing. It's just the reality of where we start, and small stressors can sort of bump you out of the zone a little bit more easily. Some of us have really wide resilient zones where you have a high tolerance for a wide range of challenging circumstances and stressors. Both of these are normal parts of, being human, right? All right. So what does this look like in practice? So in healthcare, right, it doesn't necessarily look like that nice little wavy line, right? So something traumatic or stressful happens, you're having challenging interactions with parents or patients, families get new diagnosis, we have emergencies in the ED, stuff happens, right? And what our experience of that looks like a little bit more in healthcare is this sort of ups and downs of the day. So this would be a typical day in the life of a child life specialist, right? Where something happens and you get triggered by it, and then you walk out of the room and you're like, take a deep breath. You're like, I'm done with that, thank goodness. And then you walk into the next room and it happens again, and you're like, oh my gosh. And then you walk out and you're like, oh man, I just feel so bummed out. So that line where it goes below the little blue dash, right? That would be what we call getting bumped out of the zone. So then you enter back into the zone, you sort of sit down and have lunch. And then, you get a phone call from somebody you know and love, and there's something going on in your personal life, and you get bumped out of your resilient zone into the high zone, and you become angry. And it can be the case that for people who are vulnerable to these highs and lows on a regular basis, that we can get stuck either high or low outside of the resilient zone. So yesterday, for example, I had a challenging email interaction with someone, and, it stuck with me. I left the office and I got in the car and I started to feel lonely, weird, right? You might think, oh, weird response, but I start to withdraw and I feel judged. And, and honestly, I get stuck down in that low zone. And I know some of the things that I need to do to move out of that. We're going to talk a little bit about those skills today for the initial thrust of moving away from being stuck either low or high. But it can be the case that you could relate to that, right? So being stuck in the high zone, it can be sort of classic, irritable, very angry person who, I often say, if I see someone I know and they're really edgy or really irritable, really easily angered at things, I wonder if they're stuck in the high zone, right? Or you think if it's consistent and they've been stuck in that high zone for a long time, you think burnout. Burnout is those are signs and symptoms of someone who is experiencing burnout. Or on the other side, a classic example of this would be, I was a PICU chaplain for 6 years. So walking through the unit, and I would go around and visit with patients and families, and I, see a mom, and I don't know why I picture this mom, and it's a person in particular. Picture her sitting in the back corner of the room, the lights are out, she got a blanket over her head, and there's like a light in there, like she's watching a movie or looking at her phone or something, but that characterizes, in my mind, this isolation and retreat or withdrawal from relationship that being stuck in the low zone looks like. So it can be, you characterize it as depression or sadness, numbness, all sorts of things. But those are some examples of, what does it look like? We've talked about the resilient zone. We've talked about what it looks like to be in the resilient zone. And now we've talked a little bit about what it looks like to get stuck either high or low outside of the resilient zone. So I want to invite you just here for a brief second. Feel free to write it down on your notebook or just keep it in your mind. Where are you now? So if you characterize today, where would you fall on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 would be stuck, 1 to 3 is stuck in the low zone. 4 to 7 would be sort of in the resilient zone, in the sweet spot. And then 8 to 10 would be stuck in the high zone. So where are you now? Where have you been this week? Have you ever been stuck in the high or low zones? Which I know for many of you, the answer is yes, because this is just a consequence of being a professional in healthcare. Though I think sometimes child life specialists, don't give themselves permission to sort of acknowledge that. Like, so many of y'all wear a smile all the time, and and at the same time, I think there must be a lot more going on under the surface. So nobody's going to know what your response to these questions are, but this is an opportunity just to be honest with yourself. Based on the scale to the right, what would you say an average week is for you? Where would you fall in this scale related to the resilient zone? Now, while you're reflecting on some of those things, it's so easy for us to judge our own experience, right? And to be like, well, my gosh, I shouldn't worry about this. I'm not living in a war-torn country, or, I work in a general patient care unit, which, yeah, it's hard, but at least I shouldn't complain because I don't have to deal with as much death as they deal with in the cancer unit, or, those kinds of ways that we diminish or disqualify our own experience. And I want to just invite you guys to recognize that, wherever you are, given the state of the circumstances, that's yours to own. And if it's hard, regardless of how it looks in relationship to other people, regardless of, even if others judge you, in some way, all of that, I would encourage you to disregard and allow yourself to be where you're at, right? In relation to the sorts of things that you've experienced, the sorts of things that are challenging to you, because that as a starting point for you is your starting point. And when you accept where you're at, it will enable you to begin to sort of empathize with yourself, empathize with others, and make the necessary steps to move forward from that place towards a healthier, happier existence. So this is our key concept too, right? Trauma, adversity experiences are unique and personal, right? Our perceptions of an event, of whether or not that event is life-threatening or moves you in the direction of feeling out of control, right? Those are key factors that lead to traumatic stress. Though our perceptions of those events, right, is personal. You can't, it's a unique kind of reality that's wrapped up in all of these factors of who you are as a person. And you can't change the factors that shaped who you are any more than you can suddenly just choose to be a different person, right? It's just not possible. So recognizing that our individual perceptions of these events, and the key piece of life-threatening or being completely out of control, that's sort of my, ad lib for, or my, rewriting what the DSM-5 says about acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. You can't just suddenly choose to not view the world in the way that you do. I have a dog here, and Lotus is our staff support, emotional support dog. And not everybody loves dogs. There was a nurse that came up to me one day at a presentation, and she was explaining she had grown up in an Eastern European country in a Baltic country where there had been war when she was little, and there were dogs that were loose all the time because people couldn't care for their animals, because they were just trying to survive. And she had been bitten by dogs on numerous occasions. And so when she saw a dog, sweet little Lotus, some of you may know her, little Lotus is like the sweetest little puppy. And when she saw a dog, she just saw fangs, right? And I could say, well, just don't do that. Just don't view Lotus. Look at her. She's just sweet as can be and docile as can be. It just doesn't work. And so many of you know this to be true. It doesn't work to just say, don't think that way, right? And that's true. It's a professional sort of understanding. My encouragement to you today is to offer that sort of permission to yourself. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about trauma? Basically, your perception of an event or someone's perception of an event as life-threatening, terrifying. It's an experience of being completely out of control or helpless to stop something bad. Minor events can have a big impact. Like I said, big events can have a minor impact. Perceptions and experience vary by person, and some traumatic situations endure, right? People are impacted over a period of time, and those kinds of things can have an even more significant impact on our psychic and mental, physical, emotional stability in the face of adversity. So the essence of trauma is when our nervous system becomes overwhelmed, people can lose their capacity to stabilize and regulate themselves. So another little key foundational example here. So there's big T trauma, there's little t trauma. And again, it's not necessarily, this isn't absolute or exhaustive, but, for one person, the big T stuff of life, they've been through significant natural disasters or war, sexual assault, child abuse, terrorism. Another person, a dog bite could be a major trauma. So from that standpoint, but I would say a little T trauma would be like incidental stuff, that car accident I had last summer, 2 summers ago, varying things like that. And then cumulative or C trauma is really situational. So this is kind of where intersectionality crosses. So we have traumatic experiences and we have sort of cultural, socio-political paradigms that and identity markers that place us in a position of being traumatized. And you could have one of those things. You could have grown up in poverty, or you could have experienced poverty and racism and maybe systemic injustice through the court system. That would be the cumulative C trauma. And then lastly, this vicarious trauma or secondary trauma is the experiences that you guys and I have working in an environment where trauma is constantly coming through the door. So trauma is really not necessarily having directly experienced something. It can be secondary and just as traumatic to see or hear about or observe something traumatic that happens to someone else. And then, our our proximity to traumatic events, so this prolonged exposure that healthcare professionals have to navigate, is also a key factor for secondary or vicarious trauma. So if we were in a room and I was looking at your faces, I'd be like, and I had another hour, this is a point where I would, invite commentary and want to hear your stories, because I know you're thinking things. And if you have any thoughts or questions or responses to the stuff that we've talked about, I very much want to encourage you to put those in the chat box, and Alice will probably keep track of some of that stuff. And, those questions and those thoughts and ideas, as Dee Dee and Alice move forward, will be, more opportunities for us to know what kind of things you all are facing and experiencing, so that these events can really focus in on the exact things that you guys are wrestling with. So moving forward at a rapid pace, our key concept number 3 is this idea of elegant design, right? So what does that mean, elegant design? So this is really focusing in on the physiological aspect of our being, of our humanity, right? So when things happen that are difficult, there's a shared reality in the way that we respond to traumatic events, right? We talked about that. That there are laws of nature that are at work within our physiology that you have no control over, that are born out of our autonomic nervous system and are connected to our physiological response to stress and traumatic events. And a key aspect of this elegant design has emerged through our most recent study of the brain and the impact that trauma and stress have on the brain. So from the life-changing experiences piece, I think for all of us, this is a long list. It's not exhaustive, but there are so many elements to living in the world that we live in that are, agitators of a traumatic response on our physiology. And these circumstances so many of them are out of our control. Some of it, comes to us through the television, right? Like an awareness of things happening around the world, or the news feeds that we get on our phones. We're aware of so much more of traumatic scenarios and circumstances happening to other people, and then the circumstances that everyone experiences that happen in their own lives. So the foundation of CRIM is really that resilience, a strength-based resilience and a resiliency-informed self-care is founded on this belief that our biology is a key and foundational aspect of how we grow in resilience and how we respond to stress and trauma, and that it's not mental weakness, right? So to be impacted by difficult events is not a reflection of any mental weakness. It's a physiological, biological reality that we have no more control over than we do our own breathing, our heart rate, and our, perfusion, right? Our blood to our extremities. It's a physiological reality, how we respond to stress. So CRIM's focus is on this biology related to the human nervous system, these common reactions, physical reactions to stressful and traumatic events, right? They impact our mind, our body, and our spirit in ways that we're not in control of. So our goal through the wellness skills is to help people and communities begin to see that, that physical response isn't about mental weakness or inadequacy in any way in who you are. It's just a normal biological reaction to difficult circumstances. So it's physiological, not cognitive. That's the interventions that we're focusing on. So they're physiological interventions for trauma and stress. And this approach, like I said earlier, it's super accessible to pretty much anybody because it's not psychologically oriented. So emotional IQ and, having lots of years in therapy, it's not the starting point for coping with stress and anxiety and trauma in the moments of crisis. Our skills are focused on helping you have resources in the moment so that you can be the best version of who you want to be when those challenges happen. So I just want to point these things out because, you know, we're all in various stages of coping with the challenges that we face. And some of us some days cope well, and some of us some days don't cope very well. These are common responses, right? There are relational implications for being in an environment. I put an X through the D because I don't, you know, the DSM-5 categorized this at this sort of sequelae of symptoms as a disorder. But I want to say, I think it's a normal response to prolonged exposure to trauma and stress, that we become stressed by it. And it's post-traumatic stress. I mean, this is much easier when there's like one sort of T, right? Like one thing that you can point towards. But for each of us, for you guys, the day after day of this, it just doesn't fit as a disorder. It's the reality of our lives. So post-traumatic stress is a consequence, and a common and likely consequence of some of the challenges that we face. And these symptoms or responses are just a common response. So one of the ones that I just say real quickly, if you look at that mental cognitive grouping, you know, I grew up in a traumatic home environment where there was alcohol and drug abuse and a lot of anger and violence. So, you know, I learned to disassociate when I was very young and would withdraw, and that became a skill for me. Disassociation was how I coped. And so when I started working in the ICU, I fell right back on that disassociation strategy, and it worked really well for a while for not being negatively impacted by the traumatic stresses that were a part of my daily life. But it wasn't sustainable to disassociate. It started to play itself out in my relationships with my wife, in my relationships with my kids, and, you know, things like isolation and being easily angered, and, you know, fatigue and physical pain and stress. Those were all different aspects and responses to an ongoing relationship with trauma and stress. So we want to say that some of these things, you know, you guys may be experiencing now. And I believe that, you know, as you approach your self-care strategy with resources that help you to move from a place of, you know, distress, discomfort, dis-ease towards a more neutral physical experience, right? It's sort of releasing the stress and tension that gets trapped in our bodies. That's a red flag that the physiological reality going on in our bodies is our autonomic nervous system is fired up and ready and responding to stressful situations. As we release some of those things, we begin to move in the direction of having greater control and capacity, right, for tapping into resiliency in our own lives. So we develop these skills and resources, and the key one is managing our physical sensations and beginning to be able to track those as a resource for moving us towards a more healthy place and change, right? So those are the skills. That's the starting point of the skills, is what we call tracking and then managing and resourcing. And the impact that doing that consistently has on us is that and this is all evidence-based, it begins a process of rewiring our neural connections in our brain, which right now are sort of like a trail in the mountains. You know, like some of us have deep rutted trails, and I've seen this, you know, in the mountains. I'm thinking of the Sierra Nevada mountains, the John Muir Trail. When you leave Tuolumne Meadows and you head south, and Cathedral Peak's off on the right, and you look down and you begin to see the mountains climbing up to the south, the trail has been walked so many times that it's like a foot deep. And right, you can get caught in that trench, and it's hard to break out when you're walking, right? And everybody kind of gets sucked into walking in that trench. And I would suggest to you that negative coping and, not being able to manage our physiological response to stressful circumstances, it sort of digs a neural trench, right? The neural pathways are entrenched. And so when something happens, like, an example I like to give is when there was like a Super Bowl commercial a couple of years ago where it was a Ram truck, like the manliest of trucks. And I like trucks. And it was about a farmer. And like, I started to cry like a baby when I saw this commercial. And there were just some old entrenched neural pathways that I couldn't process through at that point, which I have since then, but that I couldn't process through at that point. I just had this spontaneous reaction to the situation at hand, which was a Ram truck commercial, right? Sounds a little bit crazy. So the idea that we can begin to take control of our nervous system and our physiological response to trauma and stress moves us towards rewiring, right? Rewiring those neural pathways. And that is a key aspect of growing and strengthening and widening our resiliency. So there's hope that we can build more resilient pathways in our brain, and that it doesn't take a whole ton of work it takes a lot of work. Let's just say it doesn't take a whole lot of like you have to dig into all the emotional baggage of your past or talk about the feelings that you have related to traumatic and stressful events that are happening in front of you every single day. Now, dealing with baggage and processing through traumatic circumstances in your day-to-day is very important. I'm not saying it's not, but these skills are meant to give us a starting point when you can't process through that, but you need to keep moving forward, right? And a lot of you have experienced that where you're at the end of your wits and you just have to cut out and, go take a few deep breaths. That sort of deep breath and recentering is a key aspect of what we're offering. So when you think of these wellness skills, don't think of something that's like completely out there. They're resources and it's a framework. It's almost window dressing for things that you're going to understand, and they're intuitive and it makes sense and you're already kind of doing them. And we want to sort of fan the flame of that intuitive grassroots understanding that many of you have as to how to cope with some of these challenges as they arise. So this professor at Stanford, I think he's actually it says Columbia. I think was at Stanford previously, said it this way: resilience, and this is all from evidence, and research of understanding how people respond to traumatic events. Most people, right, respond with the ability to move forward. So resilience is the most common reaction for those who experience trauma, the ability to rebound and to move forward. So I believe that's true for each of you, that there's potential growth downstream of the challenges that you're facing. And this idea is what we call a growth mindset. And so if you reflect on what are some of the ways that you or the people around you have experienced trauma, and what are some of the things that have come from that? And I think you're probably going to see that if you were to make a list, many of the things that are on the screen now are a consequence of the past challenges that you faced. There's hope that as we face difficulty, and we, work towards remaining within our resilient zone, we're more enabled to move towards these aspects of our being, of our work, of our, desired identity that are positive and adaptive and life-giving and, really are at the core of the person you want to be. You want to be resilient and a strong person and feel grateful, and be able to advocate for your patients and families. You want to love your children and love your spouses and your friends, and have compassion for yourself and others, and be able to forgive, and feel content and satisfied with your faith, and growing in wisdom, right? And sort of knowing where you want to be. I will suggest to you that this model, and some of you are experiencing these things today. Some of you may be challenged to believe that these things are possible. I'll suggest to you that as you practice these skills, that you will be moving in the direction of post-traumatic growth. And, I think a key aspect of burnout is the sense of helplessness and powerlessness in the face of challenge. So what these wellness skills offer is a way out. That adversity, right? The sort of impact of the challenges we face, it doesn't have to be our destiny. That as we begin to practice these skills, we really learn how to stabilize our own nervous system. And it leads to a greater sense of power and control and empowerment and contentment. And then you build out of that place of resiliency, build on those strengths-based, resiliency-informed foundations as you grow personally and professionally. So you should all be like, well, man, I want to know what these skills are, because that sounds amazing, right? So the app is going to be your next go-to source, and the website, the Trauma Resource Institute. As a takeaway today, I really want you to just sort of begin this process by focusing in on what are the things that lift you up? Like, where do you find purpose and meaning and hope? And I want you to leverage that as a strength and seek more of that in your life, right? Who are the people, or what are the circumstances that give you strength? I want you to tap into those sources of strength as a way to lay the foundation for a continued building of your resiliency today. What and who sustained you? Seek out those people and situations and events and places that give you strength and sustain you. And then really identifying and naming the things that help you get through the hard times. Those are your foundations. And then the skills. So we have 6 primary skills that we teach through the Community Resiliency Model. Tracking, which is learning to identify the traumatic stress response in our physiology, not our emotions, but in our physiology. Then resourcing. So we teach you methods for shutting off the autonomic nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system's response, and shifting back towards a place of comfort, your resilient zone, which you could also call parasympathetic dominance. And then we teach you strategies called grounding, which are really everyday sort of approaches to shutting off the sympathetic nervous system's response. And then shift and stay, how to move from being triggered to a place of staying in that parasympathetic dominance as you face even more challenges. We teach you some gesturing, which are like physical things you can do, like this, or like this, or like this, that help shift your physiology without you even having to think or do anything. And then the help now strategies are kind of our closing. So that's what I have for you guys today. I've gone right to the line. If anybody would like to reach out, feel free to send an email through Hearts Connected, and you can get in touch with me. I encourage you to use the app as a next step towards checking out the skills and beginning to learn how to apply those in your life and your practice. And again, the Trauma Resource Institute is a great source of information and knowledge and resources if you want to begin to think how you would bring CRIM to the work that you do in your hospital. So thanks, y'all. Thanks for being here and allowing me to do this 45-minute monologue. I look forward to the day when we can actually be together in a room and have a conversation. So thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate it. And I appreciate you so much and taking all your great knowledge and squeezing it into that 45 minutes. So we held most of the people here the whole time, and we appreciate you. And everybody who was on, please look for recording and the survey. And after you do that, we will send you your PDUs. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Bye, everyone.